beginning of really the America, it has become more and more urban and less rural. But that's really going to accelerate here in this period after the Civil War. This is New York City's Times Square in 1900. So take a look. Of course, you probably know this is Times Square today, just to show you the comparison. And this is really representative of the growth in cities in general. This, by the way, is happening in Europe as well during this time. Between 1865 and 1915, the urban population of America increases by 700%. And in 1920, we will, for the first time, have more than half of Americans living in cities as opposed to the country. Cities have lower birth rates and they have higher death rates, which means they're not growing naturally more than the countryside. This is entirely from immigrants and from people moving from the farm to the city. Now, eastern farmers either moved west as farming began to die out in the east, or they went to the cities. Many blacks fled the south and came to the north to the cities, or they went out west. Of course, most minorities were barred from most factory or professional jobs and had to work in the service industry. We also had this idea of women's work at the time, which was that which led to more black women than men coming in the cities. The service work, being things like a maid or working in a restaurant or something like that, was considered women's work. So a black woman was more likely to come to the city than a black man. Most people who lived in cities were from Europe. Some came from Canada and some came from Asia, but most of the immigrants were European. By 1880s, many were from Eastern Europe, of course, and many Eastern Europeans would come here with no money and no education. And like the Irish had in a generation before, they tended to stay in the cities. They didn't have the ability to break out of the cities and out into the countryside like earlier German and French and British immigrants were more likely to do. By the 1890s, most people who live in urban areas are immigrants. Get this, in the 1890s, 87% of Chicagoans, 80% of New Yorkers, and 84% of the people in Detroit and Milwaukee are foreign-born. So when you went to the city, you were dealing with people who were new to America. Most had lived in a rural setting in the country they had come from. So not only are they changing countries, they're changing from a rural life to a city life. They would form what were called immigrant ghettos. Now, our ethnic enclaves, as we call them today. And these were places that would maintain the culture, the languages, the foods, the traditions, the holidays of the mother country. And so you could leave, say, Italy and come to America and live in Little Italy and speak Italian, and it would be very much like you never left Italy at all because it was essentially a transplant of Italy here. And of course they have Chinatown and just about any other country you could think of. A large city like New York would have basically that country transplanted over here. Now, and of course you would bring family members over. Very often a family would send one person over, usually a younger male, so they could work and make some money. And then they would bring over the rest of the family one at a time. A lot of immigrants went back home. About a third of immigrants would come over, work for a while, and return back to Europe. Enclaves slowed integration. If you left Italy and you came to New York and you lived in Little Italy, you weren't really integrating into American society. You had less incentive to learn the language or understand American culture. But they also provided a great deal of security for immigrants who, can you imagine leaving America and going to some other country, if you're American that is, where they don't speak your language and you don't know hardly anything about the culture, a place you've never been, and living there? You can imagine that's very scary. So these ethnic enclaves provided security. Some values that were transplanted from the old country to the new country helped groups advance. For example, Jewish people tended to really focus on the value of education. Of course, that helped them a great deal in America. Other cultural values might come from the mother country to America and hinder groups. Maybe, for example, if you have an ethnic group that doesn't like foreigners or people who aren't like them, it can slow that group's integration into society and consequently their economic success. There was a great deal of racial prejudice, and you need to understand racial prejudice here. I'm not talking about black and white racial prejudice. I'm talking about white people being prejudiced against other white people. So there was a real emphasis on where your family was from. Today you probably look at white people and go, hey, look, they're all white people. But back then it mattered if your family descended from the English or the Polish or the Slavs or the Italians or where. That was really important back then. Some came with skills and prospered. Other came with no skills and were likely to struggle. In some cities like Boston and Milwaukee, there were the cities could have such a high concentration of one ethnic group that ethnic group would actually be able to gain political power. Boston was essentially run by the Irish immigrants who came to Boston. There were that many there. And here you see a map of all the littles in New York. These are all ethnic enclaves in New York in the early 1900s. This is Little Italy here on the top on the right. There's a picture of Chinatown on the bottom. And here you see a more modern image, it looks like maybe 80s, of an Arabic neighborhood in an American community. I can tell you that I went to Chinatown and I saw a Kentucky Fried Chicken, but there was no K, no F, and no C. Everything was written in Chinese. There used to be anyway, a 7-Eleven like that as well. I haven't been there in a long time. It may not be there anymore. Most of the immigrants were between the ages of 15 and 45, and they faced a struggle that many people who hear this will identify with. The struggle between assimilating into your new culture, where you're more likely to be success, but honoring your history and where you came from. And so how do you maintain touch with your parents and your grandparents and your cultural heritage, yet be successful in this new world? And that was a tremendous pressure and strain to put on these people. They usually came with romantic visions of the U.S., and they usually became disillusioned. It turned out it wasn't quite the land of opportunity for the unskilled immigrant that they had hoped it would be. The dream was often of becoming a real American, which usually meant an American citizen, but sometimes that meant integrating into the culture and being such that nobody could tell you were an immigrant. Typically what would happen is the first generation would hold on to those old world values, while the second generation would adopt American values. And this, of course, created tremendous tension between the family. You may have an incident where the kids speak English and the parents don't, and so the child then becomes, in many ways, the more important member of the family because they're able to go out and interact with the world for their parents, which obviously creates a lot of tension in the family. And, of course, we often have couples dating each other from these different ethnic groups. You may be in Little Italy and be Italian, and you may meet some girl who's Polish. Well, today we wouldn't think much about that, but back in the day, your Italian parents and her Polish parents would be very upset about that. And so there was a lot of marriages that happened against family wishes because there was this great tension to stay true to your culture, stay within your group. Assimilation, of course, is encouraged by Americans. Public schools and employers insisted on English. Politicians as well insisted that these immigrants learn how to speak English. In most stores, if you weren't in an ethnic enclave, you wouldn't find ethnic goods. So the food that you had been cooking your whole life, you wouldn't be able to find those products in a typical American store. Many churches simply invented new variations of their church to fit into the American way of life. For example, Reformed Judaism was an Americanized form of Judaism, and a lot of Jews would come to America and be very offended by what had happened to Judaism at the hands of American rabbis who were trying to create a religion that adapted to the people it was preaching to. The sheer numbers in the ethnic enclaves tended to breed resentment. There was, as you can imagine, intense racism and anger towards these immigrants, which unfortunately is always true. A lot of that, of course, is struggle over jobs and opportunities and the idea that my wages are lower because these immigrants are coming in and taking those jobs. There's also the fear of the unknown. We talked about the dating across these racial or cultural lines, which upset a lot of people. In 1887, a lawyer named Henry Bowers forms the American Protection Association to stop immigration. By 1894, there's 500,000 members of this thing. In 1894, the Immigrant Restriction League is founded by 5 Harvard graduates. These are educated folks. And they want literacy tests for you to enter the country. They don't want uneducated people to be allowed into the country. They don't get their way. But one group that does are the anti-Chinese activists in California, who in 1882 have it made illegal for a Chinese person to come to America. This is the Chinese Exclusion Act. It also, by the way, banned convicts, paupers, the mentally incompetent, and put a 50-cent tax on immigration. And since many of these people came here because they were living in crushing poverty, that actually kept a lot of people out. In the 1890s, they again tightened the standards. Although you have to understand that the capitalists, the industrialists from last chapter, are lobbying heavily against these anti-immigration laws because, of course, the immigrants to them are an endless source of cheap, malleable labor who weren't going to unionize or complain too much no matter what was done to them.